Thank you all for coming to the faculty-led workshop. I'm talking to this microphone so the recording can hear me. I know it's not actually being broadcasted. I'm Christy Kittle over here at the Academic Outreach and Innovation, and we wanted to welcome Lisa Johnson-Shull. She is doing our second faculty-led workshop this semester for us. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her. She didn't want any fancy introductions about how awesome she is. So here's Lisa.
Now, I've got this, and I don't know if it's on. Is it on? Am I on?
Yeah.
Am I good? Okay, so I'm going to mostly stay seated until I need to get up and use the whiteboard since it's a nice, friendly little group. So let's go around and introduce everybody. I know some of you, not others, but then everybody can know who you are and what you're here for. So we'll start here.
Holly Campbell, I work for the Office of Student Conduct, and I design our sanctuary.
Great. Great.
Yeah, good to be on the mic. Katie Cooper, I am an associate professor in School of the Environment. I teach a popular UCOR class that has a significant writing component into it that's about to be moved to from about 40 a semester to 120, so I'm trying to streamline things.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Rebecca Vandervoort, I'm Assistant Vice President of Academic Outreach and Innovation.
And I'm Theron DeRosier. I'm an instructional designer at AY.
And I'm Kate Brothers, and I'm in the College of Ed Med, and I work with graduate students, and it's a pretty writing intensive course both semesters.
Okay, so let's just jump on in, and you've got a little thing of handouts, and it's kind of on the PowerPoint too. I'll tell you the objectives. We will have a little bit of information dump, and then oh, hello, yes, please. Okay, and then interrupt me and tell me who they are, what we're doing. Okay, so the objectives or the goals, and sometimes those terms are interchangeable, and one of the things we'll talk about is sort of the wonkiness of some of these terms. So by the end of today's session, my goal for you, or my objective, is that you should be able to recognize the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and that's something that I think is a useful guide for teachers. And I sometimes raise the hair on the back of the necks of some of the people in the English department that think that it's sort of passé, but I disagree. And I think if it is used sort of descriptively rather than prescriptively, it has a lot to offer teachers. I will explain the difference between goals and outcomes, which is, I think, important differentiation in how we use language. By the end of the session, you should be able to create a writing assignment with clear and concise goals and create an associated rubric using the goals of your writing assignment. So one of the things I learned in the last faculty-led presentation that I gave was I sort of bit off more than I could chew, made some assumptions, kind of went after too big a chunk. And so today's conversation is really focused, but just because it's simple, just because I think these things are simple doesn't necessarily make them easy. So let's go ahead and move on to what goals are. So goals are what you aim for. And as you see in this nice handout, we have a picture of a goal, football goal. And I think it's important to keep in mind that visual because goals and outcomes are different. And outcomes, which on the handout comes afterwards, is really the scoreboard. You can have a goal and you cannot meet it. For Seahawks fans, if you're Blair Walsh, you will know that you can have a goal and not meet it. As the kicker, he misses probably just as often as he makes it. So in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, we want to think about goals in terms of some vocabulary. And the taxonomy here, and it's probably best represented on page 2 of the handout, which is this nice, colorful circle, really looks at cognition as something that builds on itself. And so the very first level of cognition relative to this taxonomy is that students remember things, right? Or that you really just remember the word thesis, for example. That doesn't necessarily mean you know what it means. I might know that there's something called a Krebs cycle. That doesn't mean that I comprehend what it is. So just knowing and remembering a term is the first level. Understanding it is the next level, like really comprehending what a thesis is and what it does, so that you can move on to this idea of applying it, and then you have more sophisticated comprehension that you could actually analyze, that you could then evaluate, and then last, you could create. And that predicated on creating is a certain connection to these prior cognitive stages. So just kind of wrap your mind around that. The other thing I want to emphasize in terms of this taxonomy is this concept of, or these concepts of types of knowledge. Like we have factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive. And depending on the discipline that you teach and the level of that discipline, you're coming after sort of student learning in different dimensions of this. So why don't everybody here who's actually a teacher in a class maybe speak to some of these knowledge dimensions about what aspects in your class are you teaching facts, in what aspects of your class are you teaching concepts. Do any of you teach procedures, which are like, how do you do something? And at what point in your class are you doing metacognitive work? So students are doing reflections, they're thinking about their thinking, which is, according to this taxonomy, really one of the more sophisticated layers of things, particularly if you're creating at the metacognitive level, if you're looking at this matrix. So why don't we start with you, when you're working with students, and are you, in fact, I'm just going to, well, let me just invite you into this and where you see maybe what you're asking students to do fall in this matrix or with this vocabulary.
Yeah, so a lot of it's very self-reflective. And so getting to that metacognitive level is really kind of where we're pushing them, and kind of hopefully designing the sanctions, the papers, so that they kind of take those steps. So first they do a little self-reflecting. The next step is we've broken it down into stages. They do research. Then they apply an argument, and we ask them to then create an argument that they would give to their peers.
Right. So you can kind of see in this nesting how some of that is.
Right. And then hopefully the overall process allows them to see how they're thinking, and their choices. Is be aware of their own thinking and their own choices. So that's, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Right. So the class that has this writing component too is cover the entire history of the Earth, everything that happened in it. But I do, with their writing assignment, my goal is for them to think about something more deeply in the connections between different processes. So there is a lot of, since there's no prereqs for the class, there's a lot of factual information that they first have to be able to have to then be able to then move into making connections. And it's challenging because they also then need to go to peer review literature that's written at levels that are way over their heads to be able to pull out the facts to then make those arguments.
Okay.
So in this graduate level course, we have students from all the biomedical disciplines, and so they don't know each other's discipline. So we most of our writing assignments are focused on sort of at the conceptual level. We in the syllabus go to great lengths to explain the procedures of writing these papers, and then we sort of give them a soft pass on getting everybody's factual elements right, because they might be a neuroscientist who's writing on immunology and infectious diseases, and so it's outside of the realm, but we want them to take a stab at it. there's really no metacognition in this class much. I think we sort of hope they do that, but we don't prompt them very well.
Also, I'd like to introduce one of our participants.
Oh, thank you.
Her name is Cynthia O'Rourke, and she is teaching biology at WSU Vancouver and at Reed College in Portland.
Okay. Does she want to weigh in on this taxonomy? Does she have access to this?
I just
Asked her. Okay, all right. Obviously, I should let you do your job. You do your job and I'll do mine. Okay, so just wanted to familiarize everybody with this particular scheme and the vocabulary, because goals are typically written in verbs, right? I want my students to be able to do this action, this action, this action, this action, and this taxonomy provides us lots of these verbs. So if you start at the remembering level, you might say, you know, I want the student to define or duplicate or list or memorize or recall. Or at the next level, classify, describe, discuss, explain. The next level, choose, demonstrate, dramatize, or appraise, compare. And you can see as this verbiage gets more complicated that these are the kinds of verbs that can find their way into your goals. So what we thought we'd sort of start with is a little bit of a brainstorming where you, on this handout that you've been given, it's page 3, can take some notes about what some of your course goals are. And then we'll move from course goals to having you think about an assignment that you currently give and what the goals are for it. And so hopefully kind of drill down into maybe more precise goals if you feel like you're struggling with that, or maybe just affirming that you're already doing a good job of articulating your goals. But let's just maybe take a minute and think about your course, and on page 3, put some notes on about what are some of the goals of your course. What do you want students to be able to do or know or remember or apply?
So Cynthia O'Rourke says her students analyze whenever stats and results interpretation pop up. She says the course is largely number 1 at the introductory level, but with some work in the upper levels of the pyramid when they get to writing up experimental work, and occasionally also during group work.
Okay.
She also has an evolution course. I'm sorry, things keep coming in.
That's okay.
That's Evolution 403, skews toward the upper levels of Bloom's. She also asks the students in all lecture classes to create exam questions explicitly targeting one or more levels of Bloom's.
Great. Okay. So they're just doing these course goals. Feel free to rip these pages apart if it's tedious to flip back and forth. We'll take just a couple more minutes to do this part of it. why don't we sort of go around and hear what some of the goals are for either the course or, if you're not actually teaching a course, but for the environment, right? So Holly, do you want to start?
Yeah, so the goals of the assignment are always to get the students to take accountability, for them to articulate their decision-making processes, for them to understand how their actions affect others, to know what resources are available to them for support and help. And then the big one is to get them to start making what we call internally motivated change statements. So I'm not going to do this because I'll get in trouble, but I'm not going to do this because it doesn't align with my values and how I see myself as a person. So that's what our goals.
Okay.
So some of the course goals I have are to appreciate that processes do not operate independently on the Earth. And then following that, connect across the spheres on the Earth, so biosphere versus atmosphere, so on and so forth. Apply knowledge of past events to either other past events or more present or more recent events. And then recognize peer-reviewed literature and or like reliable, safe sources of scientific information. And then comprehend the timescales of processes as well as the overall age of the Earth.
Oh, okay.
So I'm actually teaching a grad course
Well,
in
and
the
I
spring.
skipped you, so you should
Oh, I
have
just
said,
stayed quiet. That's
well,
all right.
But why don't we come back to what are you teaching? And
So I, with Theron and other members of my team, we're teaching preparing to teach online graduate level course. So we're teaching grad students to develop and teach an online course. So what I wrote for my goals, so we want them to be able to write a measurable learning goal or objective, and I think that's kind of understanding what that means. But then they need to design activities, assessments, assignments that align with the goal. And so I think that's more at the top, and they need to be able to apply strategies to engage students in learning. So I think it hits a couple of different levels.
yeah. I mean, all of them probably at some point.
So Cynthia doesn't have all the documents yet, but she's answered the first question a little bit here. She said, let's go with a lab report for the writing assignment. The goal of the lab report is to touch on each stage of a peer-reviewed study, research, experimental design, experiment, analyze, report, plan.
Okay. And Kate?
So the course goals for this class are to engage in scientific dialogue and to critically evaluate the evidence, to convey a scientific argument from a written piece. So then they provide the gist of that in a scientific argument. Also, they design an experiment and a news and views article. They participate orally and in writing with their peers, and they're gaining practice critically reading primary literature and identifying the evidence conveyed in the figures.
Okay. All right.
So I'm actually teaching a class in the spring. It is developing proportional thinking for future teachers, so teaching others. So I wrote that they need to identify the phases and stages of the development of proportional thinking, but also be able to recognize what level a student is actually at. So that's kind of two levels there. And then also identify methods students can demonstrate mathematical knowledge and how to appropriately evaluate them.
Okay. All right. So you sort of set the stage with that, right? That's kind of where we start whenever we're thinking about, assignment design is, what are the goals? One of the things I think that teachers often do, and it's a mistake, but it's tempting, is to start with the activity. Like, what is it I want them to do? Instead of starting with what really are my goals? And there are several layers of goals, right? So you have these overarching goals for your course, and then out of those overarching goals, you design different writing assignments. So I want you to think about a writing assignment, and Cynthia has a lab report, for example, a writing assignment that you give or will give or want to give. and think about why you want your students to do that particular assignment. So just grab one out of your repertoire or out of your course that you're currently teaching and write what is that writing assignment that you're going to be drilling down into, and then some notes about why that assignment. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do now is kind of go to round one of the goals. And I want you to think in terms of assignments, both teach and test. So you might think in terms of goals round one of like drawing a line maybe down the middle of that and considering in the things that you said about why you want students to complete the assignment. How could that be sort of phrased in terms of goals, and which of those goals might be testing goals, and which of those goals might be teaching goals? Does that make sense? So, for example, I might give a writing assignment to my students to test whether or not they know certain things, which is different than to have them express something to me about what they're learning. Right? So one is more exposition as compared to a testing situation. And I think it's important to look at writing assignments through those different lenses. Because a lot of times one of our goals that's implied but not explicit is to test their proficiency with standard edited American English. And is that actually one of the course goals, right? So see if you can move from why you want your students to complete to some of these goals. And we'll give you about 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about what you're coming up with here.
What were those two again?
Testing and teaching. And not that they're mutually exclusive,
this assignment?
Yes, just for the assignment that you singled out. Yeah, so she understands that question because she understands that what they're doing is not testing. They're teaching. They're using it. Everybody about ready? Okay, so let's go around now and talk about what you ended up with in round one in terms of just some of the verbiage for the goals.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess why I want the students to do it. What I chose was an assignment that I give to students who have been found responsible for sexual harassment. This is not sexual assault, it's harassment. Why I give them the assignment is I want them to understand the gendered assumptions behind the way they're acting. I want them to understand how their actions affect others. I want them to examine if their actions are aligned with their internal view of themselves or their values. I want them to examine how their actions are perceived and understood by those outside. And I want them to learn about ways that they can support and show respect for all genders. So my goal is to get the student, I didn't get all the way through it, but is to get the student to articulate how gender plays out in social interactions. And so I saw that as a testing. So I want them to kind of be able to explain to me what's going on gender-wise in these interactions. I want them to articulate the pain and discomfort and how sexual harassment creates a burden for those who are victims or survivors of it. And that's also a testing, I see that as a testing kind of goal. I want them to thoughtfully examine their own values versus the way they acted. And I see that both as a teaching and a testing. So for them to understand, but also to kind of articulate and talk about that and explain it. And then to also thoughtfully examine how others see their actions and how that might affect their thinking. So an example would be how a younger boy would see their actions. And so,
So perspective.
Right, and so then, again, that would be, the articulation of that would be the testing, but also, in a way, it's a teaching. And then the last goal, or the last reason that I wanted them was to have them learn ways in which they can support and show respect for all genders, and that is actually a teaching. So I want them to articulate that, I want them to argue that, I want them to explain that to their peers.
Okay, so do you realize that right there is your rubric for evaluation?
Yeah, kind of.
So that really, at some level, it's that simple. It's that they're mirror images. The goals and the evaluation are mirror images. And I think what's really nice about what you just articulated there is if you were to put that in a grid, as we have sort of on this page right here, with everything you just said in this vertical column, you have the criteria by which you evaluate their success or their failure. So is the rubric that you're currently using quite yet constructed that way?
We have a rubric that I designed that it's general, so it's not as specific, and I do want to make changes to that because there's sometimes that the assignment that I give is not, it's not reflected as well in the rubric, but it kind of gets at those things. And so to find a way to make the rubric a bit more adaptable, rather than when I first did the rubric, it applied to these particular assignments, right? And now we've really expanded that, and so
right, because you have, I mean, and I think this is the main sort of takeaway, I think, from this particular conversation, is that if you did nothing else but fill this in with those things you just listed, you have your rubric. Now, what's complicated, and we'll touch base with what everybody else is saying here, is the degree to which you might articulate what success looks like when someone is able to thoroughly examine a perspective or explain how gender plays out. Like what does that look like when someone successfully does that? So that's the challenge.
What I tend to do is to go back to those kind of original goals about taking accountability and when they're making statements, are they internally motivated or externally motivated? So that's how I know they're either kind of mastering what I'm giving them or they're just kind of getting it along.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So then that becomes the vocabulary that fills in a grid like this. Awesome. Okay. What did you come up with?
Nothing quite as detailed.
All right, but that's why we have goals round 2.
Yeah, no, I'm brain dead after a really long week. So, well, I did have a lot of ideas of why I wanted them to complete the assignment. So, the assignment, and it's a tedious assignment. I'm actually completely scrapping it for next semester. But previously, because it's the assignment that I inherited with the class, but it's a term paper. And what students struggle with the most, because most of them are non-majors and like even non-science majors, is that they don't realize that you have to have a strong main idea that's not just that Yellowstone is the most interesting place on Earth, which is really boring to read. But the things I do want to make sure that they do is read peer-reviewed literature and connect to different studies as well as compare and contrast studies, think beyond the textbook level blurbs, practice scientific communication that isn't overly technical, appreciate the work behind the results and scientific consensus, and then get a sense of peer review and evaluation of other works, since they also have to do that as part of the UCOR requirements within writing. So I came up with 2 goals, and then I got brain dead. A testing goal really is to build an argument that's based on knowledge that they've gathered both in and out of class. And then a teaching goal for them is to be able to gather information or evidence for their argument from several peer-reviewed sources. And then I know I'll have some more, but perhaps not right now.
Okay, all right. So I'm just kind of repeating the goals for yours that might end up in a rubric or an evaluation criteria is that you're looking for a strong main idea. Right?
Yeah, and I saw that on like the example, and I was like, yes, that is hands down one of the most important things that they have to walk away.
For.
Yeah.
That you want them to demonstrate that they've read peer review journals, and there would be different ways that they would demonstrate that, right? There would be one, that they've cited proper sources.
Yes.
And then another way would be that they somehow incorporate the conversation from the journals into.
Right. I know, now I want to steal all your words.
Okay, well, you know, one of the things I think that
Yeah, which is great.
that's what these conversations are about, right? So one of the things that I heard someone say about like peer review journals and what we want students to do with it is we want to put those journals in conversation with each other.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I love that that way
Phrase of it too.
phrasing it, right? And especially when you say that to students, because they're not entirely sure what we want them to do with the peer review journals. And what you often find with younger, less experienced students is they're reacting to it when that's not what you want, right?
Yeah.
You want them to put those scholarly pieces in communication with each other and, you know, have interpretation of that, or welcome.
I love that idea. This helps so much because one of the things that I've noticed students do, and I'll get on to them, is they'll only use one source for an entire paragraph and then just wait to the very end. And I'm like, no, if you're using dates or numbers, you better have a citation after every single one. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, it'll look ugly. And I'm like, well, also, you should not just have one source for one paragraph.
Yeah. And so, you know, sort of teasing out all of the different dimensions of that, because there's the choice of the peer review journals, right? And then one of the things that I've found really helpful for my students when I'm trying to teach them to do something like that is I have finger puppets. And they, I wish I'd brought them, but you can imagine them. There's one that looks like a little old lady, and one that looks like a stuffy professor, and one that looks like a little kid, and, you know, one that looks like a mom, and, you know, one that looks like Peppermint Patty or whatever. And so what I do is I pick those up and I show them that these are the scholars that they're putting in conversation with each other. And of course, if they're all laid out on the table, they get to sort of name what the scholars are. So if they're writing about, I don't know, what would be, I'm going to talk about like boxers with cancer. Let's say that's my research paper for whatever. And so I might have a veterinarian that I'm going to put in conversation with a pet food distributor. I mean, I don't know.
Right, yeah.
Right? But what students don't often understand until I do the finger puppets with them is that they're not in the conversation. They're choosing the people to put in conversation.
Oh, this is genius.
And that's their way in is who do they bring to the table that they put in conversation, and that they're really the director of the show.
They're the fingers, but
They're
not
the
the
fingers,
voice.
but
Yeah.
they're not the folks. So, but I think in sort of doing the list that you did, you say, okay, so one of the things you're looking is how well do they choose, who do they choose, how well do they put in conversation with each other. Again, all of those are and could be too unwieldy for a rubric, but all of them are potential, right?
Yeah.
Categories for you determining how well they did those things. And I think when we can separate them so much that you have like a 20 component rubric, which is crazy, or you can consolidate them too much so that they might have chosen the peer review journal well, but didn't put them in conversation well, and those are two different things.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Okay.
This is
All right.
exactly what I needed.
Okay, great. So would you like to introduce yourself and we'll kind of bring you into the conversation as best as possible?
Hi, my name is Phil Mixter, and I'm from the School of Molecular Biosciences in the College of Veterinary Medicine. I teach a senior level M class that I just came from our last session, so I apologize for entering the conversation late and missing all the golden nuggets that have come out already. Look forward to enhancing my practice and helping those students who are about to join the workforce really gain some top level skills in fusing together some of their foundational skills that come through some other comm courses and other things. And Kay Brothers and I are colleagues and work in different ways in our unit to try and help students develop their writing skills.
Okay, so one of the things you might want to be thinking about as we go around the table is a writing assignment that you do give, And what are some of your goals for that assignment, both just in the more general, why do you want students to complete that assignment, and then to the next level of what are actual the learning goals, the things that you're really hoping that they show you that they know. And I kind of gave a false dichotomy, I guess, in terms of teaching and testing, but I think it's important to think about when we give a writing assignment, how much of it are we using to test, and how much of it are we using to give them opportunity to practice and demonstrate.
Right. So in this course, maybe that wasn't a question for me, but I'll talk. That's what I do. In this course, there's a larger project, kind of a culminating project, but there are a number of writing cycles. We tackle certain parts of the project, some component parts, and one of the things I do want them to demonstrate over the arc of the semester is enhancing their practice and get them into writing cycle and not do that, oh my gosh, it's due, I better knock that out tonight, and realize that the repetitions are actually useful when coupled with appropriate feedback. So.
Okay, right, yeah, yes, and it really helps when you scaffold it for them, right, that you sort of hold them accountable at different stages, which really prevents them on some level from waiting to the last minute, which then is never really successful because you have to be able to look at it again and again. So it sounds like you do those cycles, so those cycles sort of force them into those sessions of accountability.
Yeah. Initially, there's some sort of conceptualization of what this project's going to look like, and then we just in the few times I've taught the class this way, we focus on a couple of things. Students are quick to write the introduction before they know what the goals of the project that they're proposing will be. So I force them not to write the introduction before they've dropped the engine in. They can't, paint the outside sort of thing. So that's a really terrible analogy, but
no,
I
mean, I used house building analogies all the time.
That's a great. I've heard some of those, and yeah, they can't paint the walls if they don't know what the floor plan is.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and to create scaffolded assignments that do that, I think is really helpful. So, okay, all right. Well, we'll come back to you if you want to take some time to think about what the goals are. And the colored visual there is Bloom's taxonomy with all sorts of verbs that are a catalyst for thinking about your goals and the different kinds of knowledge that you're asking students to demonstrate.
Glad to have you. So a writing assignment that I've considered putting in the course is to review an existing online course and then write a critique of that. And the point is not as much about the student's ability to write as the student's ability to apply what they're learning and make that evident to me. So it's more of an assessment, really. Mm-hmm. And so that I can help fill gaps if there seem to be gaps. It's also, I think, kind of a safer to critique an anonymous author's thing, and it gives them exposure to more online courses and how they're developed. So those are all my whys, but I really struggled writing goals. So I wrote, one of the goals is for them to apply the knowledge they're gaining. I get confused between goals and instructions. So first I wrote critique existing course for strengths and weaknesses, applying recent knowledge. So is that a goal or is that like an instruction to the student? And the same, we would want them to describe and justify recommendations for change. So what could they do to improve the course? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that yours is a great vocabulary question, and we talked about this in the last faculty workshop a little bit. I think we really struggle with the vocabulary around this because you can have, goals are like nesting dolls, and mm-hmm. I think that's why we did the goals round 1 and the goals round 2, because all of those things are goals. But at what point do you drill down enough into the goals where they become measurable as outcomes?
Right.
And so the second set of things you said really are the more measurable goals. But I was reading something the other day that was talking about, you have a vision, and then you have an intention, and then you have goals, and it goes from big to little. But really, they're all just different ways of saying goals, and that those are nested. So the goal for this particular conversation, though, is to do the kind of thinking that ends you up with the measurable ones in a evaluation scheme, so that you're really clear that those are the primary values. And what I think is interesting is that so often, and we've got a couple slides for an example, we'll have this beautiful list of goals and then create a rubric that is measuring something entirely different. So anyway, go back to your second set that you were talking about, critique
existing course for strengths and weaknesses based on, I wasn't sure what, newly gained knowledge, based on readings, based on the way the course is designed. They do readings, they have discussion, they have readings, they have discussion, they have an application in their e-portfolio, and then they have peer critique, and then they reflect and make changes in their application. So so through that, they should be learning about the best practices for teaching online and how, and understanding their own personal teaching philosophy, and then look at someone else's course and be able to apply those things to critique that course. Where's its strengths? Where's its weaknesses? What would they make changes to?
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, that's pretty complicated stuff. I mean, a lot of that's metacognitive, right? Being aware enough of your own practice then to superimpose that. So I think, yeah, and for graduate students, fortunately, they often don't need really explicit instructions, but some of them do. And I think if nothing else, at least when you're reading what they wrote and trying to determine whether it's succeeding or not, you had all of that pretty clearly bulleted out about what you were wanting them to do.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Phil, we have Cynthia O'Rourke from Vancouver, Washington. She says lab reports are fantastic because they cover most of the main portions of the scientific process. They minimize the prior research, design, and failure/iterative aspects, but otherwise they're a good review of what it means to ask a question. Find out what's already known about your question, revise your question, design an approach to answering your question, carry that approach out. Also analyze and interpret the data that is often not at all what you expected, and then consider your results and place them in context for your own interpretation, for reporting to peers, and for determining the next question you're going to ask, and lightly considering how you will ask that question. It's an idealized version of the entire scientific inquiry process.
Yeah, and what she's getting into, and what we'll come back to, because it's also crucial to this process, and we've got a slide on that too, is the whole concept of genre, which is what is it that you're asking them to write, and do they know what goes in whatever that thing is, right? So a lab report has a pretty scripted way about it, and so that has to line up too, right? So not only what are your goals, but does the activity or the genre of the thing they're writing maximize the demonstration of that? And so we'll come back to that conversation because that's an important one, particularly with this genre of this thing called the term paper, right? Okay.
Cynthia has a real quick question also. If you release the assignment with the goals described in the assignment, how can your rubrics stray far from those goals? I design my rubrics around what the students have been asked to do.
Awesome. I mean, that's, she can go home now. I mean, I think what she may not realize is the degree to which most people do not do that. And it's not an intentional thing to not do it. It's just we overcomplicate it. That on some level, like I said, it's simple, but it's not easy. It's really simple. Once you know what your goals are, then you just, you know, create a grid around them and then a hierarchy of success to failure. I think what's often complicated, and Holly, this is kind of what we were getting at with you, is what is the language in these sort of little boxes, if you're using a grid, that brings to life what success looks like versus what less than success might look like. And for rubric creators, sometimes the only thing that the rubric creator will do is put what success looks like, and then everything else could be backed off from that. But
Cynthia just wrote, "I am home" with a smile emoji.
But a good rubric will inform the student and reiterate those goals or reaffirm them.
yes.
And some students interpret rubrics that way, sort of using it strategically to figure out what they need to do to be successful, and understand your grading criteria.
Right, and I
Your
know
assessment
that
criteria.
there's been a lot of pushback, I think less now than there used to be, on the use of rubrics as somehow constraining or restraining. They don't have to be recipes. They simply, and we'll get to that in some slides too, they're just sort of guides for, like, what do I expect to be in this thing? And that's different. Like if you're making macaroni and cheese, you need to have some pasta and you have to have some cheese. But you can have a lot of different kinds of cheese and a lot of different kinds of pasta. So it doesn't have to be really reductive. Okay?
So the writing assignment that I thought about was a scientific argument, which the students, the graduate students, write 2 of these. And we want them to do it so they can sort of have practice identifying important portions of papers where folks are making their scientific argument based on what and what's their evidence. And so that they have the autonomy or the opportunity to read in a very focused way and write in a very focused way. And we tell them that their papers will be evaluated on clarity, completeness, and connection. And I think in each one of those, if I'm being kind to us, and this is a course that I have one other primary instructor with me, and then we have 6 guest faculty that come in and are with us, you know, like every 10 days we have a new set of faculty. And so we have a lot of people looking at these papers, and so there's a lot of tolerance for how far they're willing to go before they're just, they can't get to the science for the grammatical errors or whatever. But I think if I'm being kind, I think in each of these categories we have some testing and some teaching, but primarily for clarity, it's testing. We want them to say, you've read all these journal articles, you know what a clear paragraph looks like. You better produce them in 4 pages. The completeness, there's probably a lot of room for teaching there because they miss important details until they get the practice of sort of identifying them and adding them to the scientific argument. And then the connections, I think, is the place where we really can do some teaching, which is we ask them, or we are in the class. I think we could do teaching in each spot, but I think for connections, we're asking them to sort of connect the evidence that was presented with the scientific argument that was made. And sometimes they just, whether they're fatigued or miss it, they just will stop writing. You know, they'll just miss the last 3 pieces of evidence. And so it's sort of that practice of being very complete, I guess, in what they're doing. But so we started off with a very specific rubric, probably 3 years ago. And we had students that were just like, you know, 3 is not applicable. Like they would almost just tell us this in the middle of their paper, which was sort of distracting to some of the readers, obviously. And then we had faculty that seemed to be sort of distracted by the rubric and unable to really focus on the paper, or maybe, yeah, I'll just leave it like that. And so we've gone from a fairly structured rubric for 2 years to not a rubric, and we'll see where we come back in the fall, I guess, for this one.
I was just going to offer, as far as rubrics go, providing the students that I work with the rubric, it seems to be like it would almost be counterproductive, because the whole point is for them to do some self-evaluation and to think. And if I'm giving them, like, I want to see you take accountability, they'll just, okay, I was wrong, next step, you know. And so I kind of have to be a little cagey about it.
So then what I liked about what you said was that really the rubric could be emerging accountability looks like this, and more developed accountability looks like this. And so even if I were to translate what we sort of did as it related to points to what it looks like emerging or developing, that could maybe be something that could be helpful to us as we're reading papers. Because you know that the downside is you can get so messed up in the grammatical errors and the awkwardness of this, that, or the inverted or the danglings, or that it's very frustrating for that faculty member, surely, but then it's not helping us move forward the science like we want it to, because we don't have an English prefix. We have a MBIOS prefix, a vet path prefix, you know. So.
Yeah, and the issue that you bring up is that in any given list of goals that you have, they're not all equally weighted. And so your predominant goal is going to be, are they getting the science? Or in yours, you know, are they synthesizing information, or, you know, whatever it is. And then you'd have some goals that are important but not as important. And I can show you my preferred way to do the grammatical thing in a separate rubric. And we can come back to that if you remind me.
You uncouple the mechanic. You're uncoupling the mechanics from the sort of scholarship content.
Yes, and I guess I'll just go ahead and deliver this information now. But I'm uncoupling it, and I'm also trying to persuade people not to give people points for correct use of the English language. So it's neutral. So it's what I call a neutral to negative rubric. It's uncoupled and it's neutral to negative. So if you have a moderate or modest, depending on who your students are, right? Non-native speakers of English are going to have more mistakes. That's just how it is, right? And so I would argue we want a little more tolerance for that. Certainly the ACTFL standards, the American Council Teacher of Foreign Languages, has more tolerance for the fact that non-native writers of any language are going to make more mistakes. So you have the neutral, which is very few distracting errors. And then you begin to subtract, and whether it's subtracting points or whether it's a subtracting category, as those distractions become greater. But what it does is it uncouples it from what the real goal is. So for example, in student conduct, the real goal is for you to grow up. And that's not related to facility with grammar. And so I think it's really important to uncouple those things.
And one of the, okay, so I taught English in grad school, and one of the things when I started at my job and I would see how other people were assessing papers that came in, is they would correct grammar and they would be wrong.
Yes.
And they would be like, we have to stop this because nobody's an English teacher here. We need to stop right now, unless that is your forte, you know, or it's a really obvious mistake. Like, you shouldn't be correcting that and who if you don't know.
Right. Exactly. So what did you come up with in this process?
So this is a very recent edition, so I haven't even read the syllabus in full. But I know the struggle that I have with the assignments is the fact that I'm teaching future teachers. So I have to teach with the you're a teacher hat and then also have them in student shoes. And so you can see a lot of erasing, and well, not erasing, scribbles. So my writing assignment, I was trying to see, I was going on the communicating mathematical knowledge through writing. And so I was going back and forth between, do I want them to put on that student hat and communicate in writing about mathematical concepts and their connections, because that really puts them in their shoes and realize really what type of knowledge and skills are even necessary for them to do that. Or the other one, so I have two assignments, was to interpret student work identify misconceptions, and tie their misconceptions and their successes to the stages of proportional thinking and where they are, and then identify some interventions for the misconceptions.
So some of those are pretty concrete, and you could see them lining up really nicely, like identifying misconceptions, and do they do that, and how well did they do that, and how that would all work.
And the biggest question is, which I erased, was, do I want my goal for them to be able to communicate to me that they also know the math? Because math, a lot of the people probably aren't going to have that math background, and there's going to be a lot of me teaching. Before we even talk about this, they have to know the math first, right? And so my question is going to be, for myself, is do I want to have a goal in these assignments for them to portray that they know the math? Or is this going to do that? So that's the determining factor for what else they're going to do, and whether that's going to be apparent through this.
So it might just be trial and error to figure that out, which is what a lot of this often is, and just to be okay with that at some point. That, in my experience, that's what teaching is, a lot of that. But, you know, we can share what we do so that we don't have to make each other's mistakes.
Cynthia's on delayed stream, so we're jumping back just a little bit. She says, I've found that at the intro level, the big risk isn't that students will construct lab reports thoughtlessly based on an overly explicit rubric recipe, but rather that the recipe won't be sufficiently explicit. I err on the side of explicit at the 100 level, though I don't let them know exactly how many points each ingredient is worth.
Yeah, and I think we should err on the side of explicit at the lower levels, right? And as students mature and as they get to graduate school, I think we can make more assumptions about what they should know. So I would support that as well. That, you know, and this goes back to the whole issue of genre, right? So for the most part, the person who taught us all to write was an English teacher, and he did not teach us how to write a lab report. And so to be expected to know how to do a lab report when you come to college, if no one ever taught you how to do it, is unfair. And it's good to have a teacher that says, this is what goes in one of these things in case you don't know. And in fact, you can see on page, I think it's page 6 of this handout, that's kind of what we've done, just to give you a heuristic for thinking about how different genres of writing have certain ingredients, right? And they don't necessarily spell out what the proportions of those are, but, you know, a research report should have an interesting introduction. It should contain facts and details. It should present information logically, use information from multiple sources. So really, in anything that you would ask students to write that was within a recognized genre, you should be able to make a little list of what actually goes in one of those things. It's like a marinara sauce. What goes in it? That doesn't mean that you can't have creative versions of it, but at least think in terms of what, if I'm asking students to do a scientific argument, and I think we might understand what we mean by that, but are there ingredients in that some students are not aware of until you've read their crappy paper and realize, oh, they didn't know that it should have one of these things in it. But I also appreciate that you're coming from a unique context where that's concerned. And because rubrics can be formative, as long as you're using it that way, you might bring it out, you know, especially in student conduct where you don't get a grade if you don't write the essay. You get to do it again because the idea is hopefully you're going to dig deeper into your reflective self. If you don't see the rubric until the first line around, right, and at least can say, okay, here's what I now want you to go deeper with, it can come in at some point as more explicit.
Yeah, we tend to, I read it the first time. If it doesn't pass through the rubric, the paper's returned with the rubric, and say, no, you need to do it over again, and here's where I found.
Right, that I want you to push yourself to think through this. So what time do we have? 4:36. Okay, so. Oh, okay. So at this point, I'm trying to see what, oh, I know. I wanted to show, so this is kind of your classic rubric grid that many of you are probably familiar with, and that I have on page, we'll bounce back and forth a little bit here, but I have on page 5 of 6 sort of an example assignment where it takes that sort of research paper, or in the humanities, what's a very common assignment is sort of a thesis-based argument. And it lays out that the goals are usually to have students focus on a main point. As you said, they often struggle with that, right? And one of the biggest things I think students struggle with in that is a thesis narrow enough to argue within the page limit. So I like to put that as a goal, because what will often happen is you give students, say, a persuasive research paper and you only give them 3 to 4 pages, they're still going to say, oh, I'm going to argue that global warming is bad or something. And they're like, well, in 3 to 4 pages, but you can't make this argument. I mean, so part of this whole process, I think, of having students, focus and get control of an argument. Marshall support, that's a huge one, right? As a university, it's an evidence-based culture. Most of us are always looking for the degree to which students can marshal support for their argument, to employ evidence in an organized way, integrate quotes effectively, show proficiency, and then as you can see, those goals are just lined right up. And so that's really the thing that I'm encouraging all of us to think about, is the degree to which we can do this, and then if we can't, is there another drill down? Is there one more iteration to get those goals to be tighter? And then do we have the slides from my students? So there we go. All right, so I teach English 324, which is kind of like what you were talking about teaching. It's a methods course for students who are going to be high school English teachers, and the course is teaching them to teach writing. And the other thing I'm asking them to learn how to do is to consider being writing across the curriculum zealots, because everybody needs to teach writing in order for it to work. It can't just be English teachers. Anyway, so as part of their writing across the curriculum workshop, one of the groups created these slides to show an out-of-alignment rubric with some goals that you have here. So if you want to look at it for a minute and look at the goals, clearly state your position, 2 points that support your position, examples and details, complete sentences, well-developed paragraphs, correct grammar, and then see what the rubric is doing. So anything jump out at you in terms of a lack of alignment between these two things?
Nothing in the goal about page requirement.
Exactly, right. Nothing in the goals about page requirement.
I noticed that there are 6 bullets on the left and 3 rows on the rubric.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, the specific details. That's not, what do they mean? Uses examples and specific details. It's not in the rubric.
It's not, which would be probably one of the more important things that you would want to be evaluating for. So, all right, let's go on to the other slide.
There's a typo
sorry.
in the rubric too, and that doesn't model the behavior of your.
Well, I have some typos. We have
Yeah,
some
I'm
typos in
teasing
here
it,
too,
'cause
but
yeah.
I copied and pasted as well.
Okay.
well, and these are students too. I mean, not that I'm not as capable.
The other
That's a
thing I
small-
noticed in this one is the fact that 2 of them have nothing to do with the content
Right, right.
and had everything to do with, the fancy,
The picky.
the market,
Exactly,
the
and that's
display instead of the content knowledge.
yes, and that's pretty common. And I'll tell you how I know this is so common. So here's another one. you want to, this paper should have time and place of story. It should tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It should use strategies such as dialogue and description. It should have complete sentences, well-developed paragraphs, blah, blah, blah. So see what they've got here.
So it says student has no dialogue, but does it say dialogue over?
It sort of does,
goals?
but it kind of alludes to that it could be a strategy. It doesn't insist upon it, right? Right. So what else do you see?
And they coupled grammar with the story.
Yeah. Yes, yes. So here's the thing about this. I've been a writing center director, writing center person for almost 30 years. So I have seen this every day in terms of students coming in with one set of directions which insinuate a certain set of goals and a set of criteria that are evaluating half the time entirely different things. And so my whole point of giving workshops like this and trying to support faculty is to help us to see how easy it is to do this, because it is. I mean, I've done it myself, right? Especially if you do them as two separate processes. If you do the goals thing as one process, and then, okay, now how am I going to evaluate it as a separate process? It really sets you up to end up with this lack of alignment, which is why what I really want us to do is that mirror image thing, where you actually have that list of goals and then plunk it in your rubric. Holly?
There's a lot wrong with this one.
Well, and they intentionally sort of exaggerated it to make the point.
Like the last one is not even, what is that about?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing about when we were talking about communicating success. Obviously made up, talking about that vocabulary. What exactly does success look like? If I was a student and I wrote this, this tells me that I need to be a really good liar because I want them to believe my made-up story.
That's right.
Or something really fantastic could have happened to somebody. You never know. But and then also too, like the second line there, the student's able to maintain the story genre. Well, it sounds pretty neutral. Student has no dialogue or clear. So I mean, how is that? Is it from how are those being valued? I can't tell by looking at the rubric how things are being valued.
Right, because it seems to be just arbitrary. And of course, they constructed this as just an exaggerated example, but it really is not in terms of what often happens when faculty get, because this is a lot of work, and when you get too separated from your goals and your rubric, or you actually think they are two different things, then it invites more of this kind of drift from those main intentions.
The other thing I noticed in that middle one, the one that she had pointed out, is notice that almost all of them say student blank, and then that last one on the right, storyline is clear and dialogue adds to the overall story. So keeping the way you state it consistent among the levels, emerging, achieving, and mastering. And I like taking it away from the student because I think it's a less abrasive approach. You know, your storyline is blank. You know, not
instead of you are. Yeah, and I think that's a good. Rebecca, you were going to say something?
Oh, I just was noticing the story is obviously true.
Like, who would know that?
Well, and is
and
that
who
important?
cares? No.
Yeah.
No.
Is that the crux of a good story?
No.
If it's true? Because
Yeah.
then I don't read any good stories.
Yeah,
so.
but I think the person would be a better writer if the story was false.
Yeah.
Right, and you
Yeah.
thought it was true. So,
Yeah.
but these things are not outside the pale of what is commonly seen. And to go to your point about the drift of the definitions, the thing that I would do is I would start with the mastering or whatever your main category of success is, and put relative to each goal or criteria what success looks like, and then cut it and paste it in each other of these cells, and then back the language off. And that way you know that you're not drifting all over the place and using organization in one and flow in the other, and that kind of inconsistency in vocabulary is what confuses so many students about what is the difference between clarity and flow, or fluency and organization. Because if you use this different terms, and that's where the same thing with goals and outcomes, for example, the English department right now has a outcome statement, which is a set of goals. And I want them to change it because I think we have to be better at being clear of how those things are different. Outcomes really are the measurable scoreboard things, and you can have goals that are never met and that are, you know.
Can you give an example of an outcome and a goal?
Well, yeah, okay. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think in terms of the football analogy, right, the goal is that, you know, Blair Walsh is going to kick a 3-point, and the outcome is that he doesn't. So in terms of student learning, and you can help me with this too, the goal might be, well, let's look at some of that. The student presents evidence in an organized way, but the outcome would be topics of, or paragraphs have no logical relationship between the topics. And so the outcome is the demonstration of either the success or the failure of that goal. Can anybody else think of a good example?
Wouldn't the outcome be the grade?
Well, the outcome overall is the grade, but the outcome in terms of what the particular goal was would be how successfully they demonstrated. And usually the outcome is measurable. It isn't always. So, but you could probably measure the degree to which, say, 5 paragraphs or 4 paragraphs or 8 paragraphs related to each other. I mean, if you did sort of a descriptive outline really quickly, which is where you look at what a student wrote, and you might say, okay, this particular paragraph is about dogs, and this one's about cats, and this one's about pigs, and now we're back to dogs. And then you can see visually, oh, you jump from this to this to this. You could essentially say, you know, 3 out of these 7 paragraphs are not in a logical or chronological, or whatever your organizational structure would be, order.
Cynthia's comment is that something that I would like to see addressed is the challenge of tailoring a graduated rubric such as this one to standardized application by multiple graders to minimize the effect of the grader on the student grade.
Oh, good question. I think the norming process.
I had this experience with one program here on the university. They had about 20 student graders, and we showed them one student assignment, and we said, grade this based upon your grading system, which was a 3-point scale, pass, failure, average. And they were split evenly, 10 and 10, failure to high level. Oh. And so through the conversation, we found out that half of them were focusing specifically on grammar and punctuation, and the other side were focusing on critical thinking. So what are the implications for a student in that program?
Yeah. So actually, that's one of the things that I think I'm offered, and I hope the faculty might consider, would be to, okay, so do you want to give a grammar and a writing score? Okay, then let's just give 3 points for grammar and writing, whatever it is, a 1, 2, 3, 0, and then let's give some points specific to the scientific content, just so that they have a place to sort of offload for some writers all that challenge of the grammar writing. It does it uncouples it. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, but I think you're getting at something where she's concerned. Like if you uncouple all the stuff that's either you did it or you didn't do it, like page length or like correct citations or any of that, if you uncouple all of the facts, like correctness stuff, because you don't need to norm over that. right? If it's incorrect, it's incorrect, although, you know, some people might not know grammar, like you were saying, the people that fix it and it's wrong. But move all of the black and white things off the table and just focus on what are the gray areas. But even the university writing portfolio process norms its readers and raters almost every time they meet. So it's one of those things, I think, faculty, if you want to bring a bunch of TAs in because you have an enormous course, then you don't want to just hand them the rubric and send them all off to their separate corners, but you want to do exactly what Theron was talking about. And it reminds me of when Mary Wack was chair of English many, many years ago. She brought us all together in the Alumni Center with a bunch of, which 3 student papers. And remember, one was green paper, one was blue paper, one was yellow paper. And she gave all the faculty of English, you know, carte blanche to evaluate, and the same thing happened. F's and A's in the same paper. And then when we talked about it, then people start moving more towards the center. And I think that's really the only way to do that. But it's certainly worth it if you want to have help and you don't want everybody having their misinterpretation.
Yeah, this is something that I worry for our true intro service level class, which is 600 students. Oh. And in their lab sections, they do have to have some sort of writing component, again, since it's a UCOR class. And so, but you're having graduate students who are not only like, there's problems that they're not teaching things the same way from like one student to the next, but they're definitely not grading the same way. Right. So that's something I will harp back during like the course revamp that we're doing, that there needs to be a lot of communication about that.
And then the other thing you can do to sort of stabilize is separate what is observable from what is evaluated. So even, you know, looking at Bloom's taxonomy again, if you're a new grader or even a peer reviewer, you might be able to observe certain things going on in a piece of writing and not necessarily be able to appraise how well they're going on. And so one of the things that I make sure to do with introductory peer review, and I would do this with new graduate students, is have them look for the presence of certain things. Like, is the evidence there or not there? Is there a thesis statement there or not there? Things that are observable. How many paragraphs are there, for example, in a 4-page paper? Sometimes there'll be 2. That's a fact, right? I observed 2 paragraphs in a 4-page paper. So if organization was one of the criteria, then a red flag, you know, starts waving that might be a problem. So the degree to which you could separate what are you asking your TAs or your co-reviewers to observe versus judge, appraise, or evaluate, and then maybe save the more complicated task for the person with more experience. And that's why peer review often doesn't work, right? We ask them to evaluate each other's work when we really just observe, right? Notice, identify, list.
Yeah, when I have the students peer review their papers, what I make them do is say, read like the first paragraph and see if you can figure out what the main idea is, and then say it back to the author. And if the author is like, that's not it, then they have some issues.
Right, and that's very much that thing. It's observing. I'm observing this, and I'm rephrasing it. I'm not evaluating. I'm not saying this is a terrible paragraph. I'm not saying I like it, because that's worthless. I'm just saying this is what I notice, or this is what I observe. You have a comment?
Oh, I'm in my 400 level senior undergraduate class for science majors. Again, the peer review process is part of that scientific endeavor, and peer-reviewed publications are important, as they are in many fields. But training students at that level to go to see past the grammar, you know, when you start to have them peer review, they're stuck on the mechanics. And I love this. This will help me train them as peer reviewers. And the idea is to also force them to reflect more critically on their own work. They're peer reviewing drafts in that process, but it's giving them insights into their own draft at the same time. And again, we'll help them get understand and normalize some of the expectations that are sometimes embedded and hidden to some students.
Right, right. And the whole sort of ingredient approach, I think, really lends well towards a certain kind of peer review. Is these are the things that are supposed to be in one of these. Go in and see if they're in there, right? So, okay. Other comments or challenges, criticisms in our last 4 minutes? Anything?
One thing Cynthia said is she does the grade normalization meetings, at her, but she says they take a long time. And I agree. One thing that I've used is, for example, in Blackboard now, you have a tool that you can give the same paper to multiple graders, and you can have them use the rubric to grade it, and it can be a really good way to quickly find red flags. You can see that there's a big difference in grading, and they can do it on their own time. They don't all have to meet in the same faculty meeting.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing would be do more things with less ingredients, right? So if you, for example, a formal summary is something that I give a lot because it's really easy to evaluate. It's just kind of a sort of simple genre in the sense of it's not asking for an opinion, it's not asking for any sort of outside evidence. So maybe more things that are not asking for 5 intersecting things, because that's when it gets complicated. And that's when I think a lot of faculty shoot themselves in the foot by assigning a 8 to 10 page research paper. In an 8 to 10 page research paper, there are 25 at least things that are going on in there that you could notice, right? There's grammar, there's organization, there's evidence, there's focus, there's ideas, there's word choices, there's jargon usage, and then when you get too many moving parts, then it becomes way too much time to get people synced up with it. So, and I also think that this is heresy for me to say this as a writing teacher, but sometimes, even though, well, writing is a deliberate practice skill, so you have to do it over and over and over and over and over to get good at it, but if we evaluate student writing too much, then they stop wanting to do it, they hate it. The view from the Writing Center is 90% of the time a student will sit down next to you and say, I'm not a very good writer. And they distance themselves from it because they're so tired of arbitrary evaluation that they just don't even want to tackle it anymore. So separating the play from the performance, and then maybe having the performance be few and far between with not so many moving parts to really diminish the level of arbitrary as much as possible. And why an 8 to 10 page paper if the exact same goals could be satisfied in a 3 to 4 page paper? So the win-win is maybe less is more with some of this stuff.
We also do, I do audits of, so just, I mean, we've done the norming, and then occasionally I'll go through and pull papers just that other people have graded. And if they match what I would grade, then I know we're still on track. But when they start to like veer, then it's like, oh, time to sit down and reevaluate what are we not understanding together as a team.
Right, right. So then you don't have to norm all the time, but you do periodic check-ins to see that. All right, well, we are out of time, and I really appreciate that everybody came. And I want to invite you to email me if you want to come and sit down with me in my office and talk about any of this. If you want sort of a brainstorming session with assignment design or rubric creation or any of those things, I'd be happy to sit and visit with you. I mean, we've gone round and round with this presentation, and just the conversation is always enlightening to have somebody to talk to about your teaching.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for coming.